Fiona Murden, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Excited to have you here. So tell us, what's this new life connected framework that you've been working on?
So life connected the framework is about looking at 20 plus years experience of working with people. And by background an organizational psychologist. So I've spent a lot of time profiling leaders for our in-depth psychological profiles to see if they're the right fit for a CEO role, for example, and what the risks are of hiring them and how they're going to fit with the team and all those sorts of things. But then very much beyond that is helping to develop and grow people, leaders, and right down to I've worked with kids in schools and doctors and surgeons in hospitals. And the thing that is the common thread across them all is that we need to feel a sense of connection. And that sense of connection is three ways. So it's to ourselves. How do we connect to ourselves? How do we know ourselves? It's to others. So what's our relationship with other people, and how does that impact us? How does it help us grow? How does it help us live? How does it help us feel alive? And then we have a connection to something bigger. And for some people, that might be religion or spirituality. But for all of us, it's about what is our why, what's our purpose. And often when we look at purpose from a scientific or evidence-based perspective, it's about not just what we want, but it's how we're contributing. And that's not to say everyone wants to be a do-gooder. It's actually what evolves when we look at when someone finds their true sense of purpose and meaning in life. And so in essence, it's about helping people to navigate life through looking at those three aspects and that through that lens of life connected.
Wow. Okay. And if you can, I guess, advise someone on what's the approach that they should be taking. How do we figure this out? What's the steps to figure out your purpose and why?
The purpose and why is a hard one. It's not one we can just sit down for half an hour and go, that's what life's about for me. And I think we all know that. We know that it takes time and it takes work. It's something that even when we have identified will evolve and grow with us. It's not a final destination as such. It's a way of being. So if I was to give an example of, for me, when I wrote my first book, it was all about, I want to translate psychology into sort of everyday language for people. And that has grown and evolved to be, I want to help people to feel more connected to life, i.e. life connected. It's the same thing. It just has a different spin on it. It has a different nuance to it for me personally and where I'm going. But I'm really lucky that I have that. And I know I've worked with a lot of people who are seemingly successful who don't feel a connection to their why or their purpose. And it does take a little bit of soul searching. So it's understanding your values, it's understanding your strengths and your passions, and then it's pulling those together into something. And that the difficulty can be that if someone is stuck within a corporate role or they're stuck within a job because they have financial demands, which means they have to do it, it's far more difficult to say, hey, I'm just going to go off and do this, or I'm going to go off and do that, or I'm going to create a new way of living. And in that sense, it's helping people to think about how they connect to it outside of work, how they actually live through their passions, through their interests, how they contribute, what they do. But I think that the classic example, and you'll probably have heard of this, is Viktor Frankl, who was in Auschwitz. He was a psychiatrist, and during his time in Auschwitz, he watched people, and he said he noticed over and over again that the people that survived were the people, literally survived, that lived, were the people that had a sense of meaning and purpose. So it's incredibly powerful. But that meaning and purpose, again, when you break it down from an evidence-based perspective, so what we know from research is it tends to be our strengths and our passions, our values, and it tends to be contributing in some way to something other than ourselves.
When someone has a choice to start a business, there's so many different models out there that you can choose. And typically people aren't necessarily at first maybe starting the business or doing a business that's their passion or feels like their purpose and why. Do you feel like that's the wrong approach for someone to go into business, to start at something and figure out and just get great at it and kind of pursue the hierarchy of becoming a successful entrepreneur, even at something maybe you're not passionate about, that's still useful, or that is the right approach? Or would you say that by not really knowing with clarity what you're really passionate about and why you want to do something, that you're doomed to fail at that?
It's a really great question. And I don't think it means you'll fail. I've seen a lot of very successful people, whether entrepreneurs or founders who in effect are entrepreneurs, or people who are CEOs of organizations who aren't fully living their purpose. They are very successful. It means that we're not quite as fulfilled and we're not quite as happy. For some people, it can mean you burn out quicker because you're pushing against something that doesn't align with what you truly believe in. But I think there's also a stage of life thing, because I think within your 20s, you can throw yourself at something that might not be your true passion, but you can make a real success of it. And you've got that drive and that energy and that I am going to do it. Later on in life, when I've seen, and we actually know from the statistics that entrepreneurs are much more successful as they get older, the success rate increases. And that could, to your point, be part of the reason, is that not only do they have experience and they've seen where things may go wrong, where things may go right, they can see around corners, as I would say, more easily because they've had that experience. But they also have that sense of, I know why I'm doing this. This really matters to me, or this is something that I fully, fully believe in.
So in the beginning part of life, you've got more energy, more bandwidth, more, I'm not really sure what is out there. And it's better to almost just start something, even if it's not your passion. Because as you get that momentum, then you can build yourself towards having greater clarity of how the world works and be able to then position in your next ventures how you can be the most effective, how you can combine the pleasure with work. You know, it's almost like such a delicate balance to find something that's so fulfilling, but can be profitable, can be valued in society at the same time. Is there anything else that comes to mind that like stands out for people that are like, I guess, feeling like they're lost in their quest for a why, that they can be doing, that they should be doing, like some practices or ways that they can kind of hone in earlier on in their journey to what they really should be doing?
Another great question. And I think it comes down to things like looking at your values, which is where you can go online and there are loads of different free exercises where you can go and explore your values. I would suggest going to, for example, there's a site called positivepsychology.com. And if you go there, most of their material is properly research backed and they have a lot of free material. So go somewhere like that, look at your values, explore them. Your values being the things that really matter to you. So, for example, one of my core values is that I cannot stand seeing someone bullied. And I will go, it really riles me up. It will make me incredibly angry and very quickly very vocal. whereas in other situations I might consider things a bit more. And sometimes we can look at the things that really irritate us, and what does that tell us? And what it tells me in that example is that I care about people being treated fairly, being treated with dignity and respect. I believe in everyone being given a chance. And so you can explore things and think, what are those sticking points for me? What are the things that really rile me up if I'm rubbed up the wrong way? Why? Why do I do that? And then on the other side, it's the things that, what really lights me up? It might be something like humor. It might be something deeper like relationships. It might be something like curiosity. But if you do these exercises, it's a great place to start exploring that. And then thinking about, and there in these places, you do have materials as well that help you work it out. There's also my first book, which is called Defining You. And that has steps for people to walk through to explore all of this sort of stuff. Again, it's all based on research and evidence. But it won 2 awards, so I think it works and it's helpful. But I would say, do that. Look at your strengths as well. What are your strengths? And if you don't know what your strengths are, go and ask people, because other people will be have far more clarity about what you're good at than you may have yourself. And what are your passions? So what are the things that you just lose a sense of what time it is when you're doing them? What are the things that you get so lost in? And just gather those things together and think, well, what does this mean? What does this tell me? How can this fit somewhere in life? And talk to someone else, because trying to do all this on your own, you can end up going in circles a little bit.
As you've studied life and you've thought about this and you've written books at the human condition, what is your realization, or how do you understand who we are and why we're here in this experience? If you had to diagnose consciousness and us being here and like this experience of life, I guess, what have you learned? What has life taught you about why we're here?
I'll say that's not such a great question because it's really hard to answer. It is a great question. I have my own personal perspective. I think that while we're here on Earth, we are here to connect with one another and lift one another and understand one another, which unfortunately society teaches us almost the opposite. And we absorb a lot of the messages from society about being independent, doing it on our own, getting ahead. And that alienates us from other people. I think we're getting more and more to the point where people are understanding the need for us to connect and how interconnected we are. And interconnected doesn't mean we don't have our own individuality. It means that we are not on our own, actually. And I think there's a real need for us to understand that humans are actually good. There's a lot of bad stuff happening in the world, and there are individuals who are not good. And I could say something about that, having worked with a lot of leaders and profiled a lot of leaders. Unfortunately, it's the ones that are not good who seem to slip through it and get up to the top. But people in large part are good, but we've sort of been fed these messages, and we have this very disparate discourse in society at the moment where we're against each other as well. And I just think that's really sad. I don't think that's why we're here.
So you believe deep down that we have a true desire to connect, that we are feeling more isolated and are fractured in some of our habits as stationary workers, and that there's a prevailing good force that operates and is trying to inherently teach us. Do you think that life is happening on purpose, that there's the free will aspect where we have kind of our choice for events to occur? Or how much do you think sometimes we have kind of events that are happening for the purpose of us to go through the hard times? Like, do you think that that there's some meaningful guidance, I guess, from like beyond or like outside of ourselves, or that's helping us experience the realization or the epiphanies that come with the new connections that are formed when we get through the hard times or we have a terrible loss in life. Like, is that, why do we have loss?
I don't know. I What sprang to mind when you were talking then was Einstein, and I won't get the quote completely right, but he said something like, "The more I learn about life, the more I realize that there is something bigger, whether it's God or another force." I don't know personally, from my perspective, how much I believe we go through those things for a purpose. I do know that going through those things can positively inform life and growth. It can also damage people, and that damage can be very hard for them to then get out of, because it can mean that they go down a hole of addiction or something like that, which is not their fault. I don't know how much there's a bigger guidance and a spirituality and a universe or a God. But I know on a scientific level, which I'm actually trying to move away from science because I've become a little bit too about science. And that's one thing that LA's done, is teach me to just, I mean, I've been doing improv and things like that, which is obviously far the other end of the extreme. But one thing science teaches us, and for my second book I worked a little bit with a guy who's head of brain sciences at UCLA. And he did this really interesting research where he was looking at empathy and he was looking at how people behave to one another. And he used a technique, obviously with people's permission, where he immobilized, froze the prefrontal cortex, and to look at how people behaved in certain situations. And when that was done, people are more generous. They were giving more. They wanted to help other people more. And what I drew from that and did check back with him was, surely that says the prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain which gets most programmed by society and by the messages we gain growing up through life. That actually the most natural response that we have as humans is to help one another.
And this was because in the study he immobilized, he froze the prefrontal cortex,
Yeah.
as in slowing it down, as in how did that work?
I can't remember the exact mechanics of it, but it basically means that you're looking at other areas of the brain, and that the other areas of the brain are not being influenced by messages from the prefrontal cortex, because they're operating not in isolation of it, but as much as you can when you're looking at brain studies. And I found that really exciting as a piece of evidence, because it's like, well, we've had all this debate for centuries with philosophers, all sorts of people. Are we inherently good or are we inherently bad? And one piece of evidence, this piece of evidence, says actually we're inherently good. And I'm sure you've heard of the book Humankind, where there's a guy who's put an argument together. It's a really well written book, a Dutch author, and explain it, basically looking at the parallels of what two different philosophers think about people being inherently good or inherently bad, and then exploring it throughout history and what history tells us. And overall, the conclusion is people are inherently good.
So by inherently good, there's a potential neural pathway that we're having. Our brain has, from my understanding, that we have the prefrontal cortex, right? We have this limbic system within the middle. We have a reptilian brainstem that helps make quick fight or flight decisions in moments when we need to hijack our decision making, and we can't ponder in a frantic situation where we might get eaten by a bear, or have to make a very fast decision to run, or embrace fighting to be able to survive. So if we have this kind of interesting brain sequence, is there any research or other things that you've come across of how powerful or subtle these neural pathways, the way our brain works, that influences the extent of our actions, our mood, our gestures, right? So if we're prioritizing giving when we have a prefrontal cortex that's being impressed somehow or being studied and influenced, is there, is there the in society, is there a way that we can start to try to actually maximize or understand how the brain works and be able to influence it to have better success or to have a better form of expression within ourselves, and to ultimately lead to a better, more peaceful life?
I would love to think so. And that's kind of more the content of my second book. So, that's why I was talking to Marco Iacoboni, who's the professor. But we have a lot of natural mechanisms which we could tap into that we just don't, and we kind of know, and we know them almost as common sense. So, for example, we know that role modeling or modeling people influences our behavior just immensely. So that there isn't an exact percentage, but there's thinking that 70% of our learning is social. So we're learning from other people, and that extends way into adulthood. It's not just with children. And so we're watching and learning the whole time. And when we have a very negative influence, we will be negatively influenced, and it will more likely pull us towards that. Whereas if we have a positive influence, it's more likely to pull us towards the positive. Now, obviously, we've all got our own morals, our values, our way of operating, which influences things. But we do see within society, when we get things like a mass shooting, one mass shooter will learn how to carry that out from another mass shooter, and they will have some sense of connection with them. We can use those things positively. We can say role models, like positive role models. We know that we talk about them. It's sort of in the common vernacular, but we never tap into that. We don't say, how can we use these role models, these positive examples to help people? We kind of leave it to chance. And so we have all this stuff coming from social media, which is, we know the algorithms tend to be positions toward the negative, because to your point about the fight or flight response, our brain will tune into the negative because it creates a sense of fear, and the fear means we've got to do something about it. So social media giants know that, and they will pull us towards those negative things. But that means we're watching negative content and we're consuming less positive content. So there's positive ways of doing it by taking things like that and using it. But there's an example by a Swiss neuroscientist called Grit Hein, and she looked at football fans and rival football fans and how the brain responded to seeing a rival football fan in pain. And unfortunately, not only did so in a fan from the same team, what you'd see is the empathic areas of the brain would light up. So that means people are, I want to help. So empathy, to an extent, is in aid of us then doing something and helping someone. If it's the rival fan, those areas of the brain didn't light up. And sometimes it would even show areas of the brain like the dopamine release, meaning the reward pathways would be triggered. So some people would enjoy seeing a rival fan in pain, which obviously is not nice. But she then did another study, and she looked at naturally dismissed populations within Switzerland and how people responded to them. And there was the same sort of pattern, not necessarily the pleasure seeing them in pain, but the empathic pathways in the brain weren't triggered when someone was dealing with an out-group member. Then, this is how simple it is. She got people to talk to one another and to get to know one another. Ran the same experiment again, and the empathic pathways in the brain are triggered. So basically what I'm saying is, so there's the role modeling piece. Why are we not using more positive role models? Why are we not leaning into that more? Because it's such a natural mechanism to use. And the other piece is, if we just literally take the time to get to know people, we become more empathic.
To an interesting personal anecdote, when playing pickleball and you're going up against a really good opponent, someone that's on the opposite team, and you don't know their names, you can feel that there's a palpable, more competitive edge that's going on, especially if you're at a very similar skill level. And what's fascinating is there's like a different experience as soon as you get on a first name basis. So as soon as you extend yourself to communicate and just say, hey, by the way, like, what's your name? Like, what's your guys' names? There's like a whole change in the quality of the court versus just playing against an opponent that you don't know anything about. And so even my personal experience confirms that your opponent or rival you want to beat until you can gain familiarity and see yourselves with some similarities, like you have in common, like, hey, like, where are you from, your name, you start having common ground between each other. And then that creates the parts of the brain that's lighting up, where you start to care and where you connect. Do those parts of the brain that light up, how much of consciousness in this zone of familiarity, in the zone of empathy, like kind of seeing from another person's view, how much does that influence yourself, like you in a conversation?
Me, personally,
From your personal experience or in like scientific research, how much does that empathy or having your awareness more on the person you're talking with and what they're feeling and seeing influence how you can perform in conversation or the exchange of talking together?
massively. I don't know from a brain perspective, but then I can put my psychology hat on and I can say that as soon as we become aware and we are intentional about connecting with someone, it changes the quality and the depth of that relationship. And if people are interested in reading more, there's a great book by a Professor Barbara Fredrickson, which is called Love 2.0. And she's done a lot around the neuroscience of how we connect and what that means. And I think this is one of the problems that we have, is that we will mistake having conversations with people or having friendships with people as being, well, I have connections. I have that. But actually, it's very different to leaning into what that means. So two examples. If we take the first one, I'm talking about having friendships. So I moved to Los Angeles a year and a half ago. And I've talked about this stuff for a long time. I know that relationships are massively important for well-being, for success. I was suddenly many, many thousands of miles away from my closest friends. I mean, I've got friends in different countries, but this was like, oh, it's gone. And I'd get to maybe 6 o'clock in the evening and something would happen where I'd just pick up my phone to text a friend and be like, oh, they're asleep. And I felt so lonely, and it was a horrible, horrible experience. I now have some amazing friends, and I just keep meeting more and more amazing people here. But it made me personally realize that I had friends, but I had taken them for granted. And I had been in pursuit of success in my career and not really understood and valued what friendship means until it was gone. So I think there's that piece in terms of our friendships. I think it's not just having them, it's actually appreciating them and investing in them and thinking, wow, I'm really lucky to have you in my life. And then on the conversational piece, we can have a 5-minute conversation with someone And on the surface, it looks exactly the same as another 5-minute conversation. But if we're intentional and we really look at that person and we ask them how they are and we mean it, what happens is very different. And that's what happens at a biological level is very different. A physiological level is very different. And so I think we have a lot of these conversations with people where we might feel like we're listening or we might feel like we're connecting, but we're not putting that extra bit of intention in, which can make such a difference. And a very simple example is you go to a checkout in a supermarket, particularly in the US, everyone goes, have a nice day. How are you? Have a nice day. And, you say it back, have a nice day. Good day. Thank you. Yeah, whatever. If you actually stop and you look at the checkout person and you look them in the eye and you say, how's your day going? You mean it and you look at them. The expression on their face just says it all. Oh, someone's actually stopped to notice me, to see me, to know me, to want to know what's going on for me. And it's the same time, whether you're going to say hello and I see you, or you stop and you actually intentionally ask them. But what you get back is immense, but what you give is absolutely immense as well.
Yeah, you don't value something until you lose it, and you've got the space to ponder how that felt. And it sounds like by going to Los Angeles, you really had to kind of start over and build this new friend network. I'm curious, what group activities do you enjoy the most? Like as you're in your work and your professional career and you're balancing your self-maintenance activities and then your group activities with friends and individual relationships, what do you find the most joy in doing? Or do you have group things that you that you love the most that brings a lot of people together in a fun way? Or do you prefer more individual, one-on-one investments with your close friends?
I like both. For example, Sunday, I spent the afternoon, unfortunately not taking part because I have an issue with my elbow, but boxing. So a group of about 20 women. And it was so much fun, even being there and not doing it. I used to do kickboxing, but I haven't done it for a long time. And then we went out for a late lunch. And people that didn't all know each other. These people brought together by one friend of mine who just has this incredible ability to create a safe and welcoming space. And so many diverse people join her activities and just get on. And someone said to me the other day, isn't it amazing how all these different people that Hillary brings together get on? And I said, then I put my psychology hat on and I'm thinking, yeah, what is that about? And it's because she genuinely wants people to connect and she creates a safe space for people to do that. So there's activities like that. I like parties. I've just done improv, which was, and I'm going to do some more, but it's basically 6 hours a week in a room full of people I'd never met before, from age 21 up to 60, and making complete fools of ourselves and hoping that we remember a line or come up with something when it's our turn or when we're sort of performing. That was immense fun. I created a WhatsApp group, which is something I never would have done before I moved to Los Angeles, but now I'm far more proactive around these things. And we continue to remain friends, as a group of very different people. And then one-on-one, I like doing things like hiking. I like walking on the beach. I like cycling. I love snowboarding and being in the mountains. So for me personally, there's a lot of different things, and there are lots of different people, because the people that like snowboarding don't necessarily like hiking, or vice versa. I mean, there is tends to be a crossover in that example, but you know what I mean. Someone that's doing improv may never have been up the mountain before. So I'm really enjoying the mix of people. I mean, I just give you one other example. We've moved since we've been here, but the first place we lived in, little windy roads, I think the types of bits of Los Angeles you don't know unless you're here. And a neighbours a few doors down, every Sunday they had block tails, and they still do. It'd be 5 o'clock on a Sunday. Everyone comes along with a drink. Now, it could be whatever you want. Some people bring a bottle of wine. Some people bring like a steaming coffee. But everyone comes around, stands in the road and talks. And it's people from like babies up to people in their 80s. And just such a lovely environment and such a supportive, friendly environment. And we go back to those as well, actually, on Sundays. But again, just all these different people, all different ways of connecting.
And the importance of finding those time blocks, right? Because you're saying we evolve by the role models and the people that we're around, and friendships and the connections that we have when we apply sincerity, when we actually open ourselves to their world, we can deeply connect and become familiar and experience the joys of friendship. There's also aspects of just the overall health of yourself, like how important to your individual health. What goes wrong in today's society if people are not spending that time to find the relationships and one-on-one activities or group activities?
There's a brilliant book, another one, by a guy named Vivek Murthy, who was Surgeon General initially for Obama and then for Biden. He's no longer Surgeon General now. But when he first became Surgeon General, so he's a doctor, trained at Yale and Harvard, both of his parents were immigrants and doctors who very much went into the community and got to know their patients. He took over this role and he thought, I want to go around the US and find out what the biggest health issue is. And so he literally just went around listening, looking at data, exploring. And he came back with loneliness. Loneliness is killing us. It increases our risks of dying. We know this. It increases our risk of heart disease. It increases our risks of everything. And it's physiological, as well as being the fact that we don't have the helping mechanisms there in our environment. It's critical. It's critical to our well-being. It's critical to our mental health. There's some research that shows that addicts are less likely to become addicted, or they're more likely to recover if they have a genuine social support network. You look at something like Alcoholics Anonymous, that's built around a social support network where people are together and then they have sponsors, which I would say is like a mentor, which is something else I'm passionate about. So it's part of who we are, how we operate, what makes us healthy, what makes us successful, but yet we kind of take it for granted.
We do live in a wild world where isolation is more prevalent, where we're always in front of our screens, and the balance of remote life and the demands to get a lot of things done in a workday, and then the extra time that you have and coordinating with people to do activities, so that beyond the challenges that there are for people or the excuses, I 100% agree that the importance should be weighed on establishing ways that you can put yourself in the environments, or to coordinate or open yourself up and try to meet people. If you're at the initial phase where you just move to a new location, or if you're already blessed and you have already great friends, then you just got to make sure you're finding the right time that you can budget for them. If you're on the beginning phase, or even if you have a network of people, what's missing that would make people exceptional at communicating?
That's really interesting. I've just had someone on my podcast actually he and another guy who is a world leader in positive psychology have written a book called Radical Listening. And it goes beyond active listening. And I think it's about, it's this fine balance of not trying too hard and not sort of like, I think I don't like the term active listening. I have a real problem with it because I think people think that they have to sit there and do this. And of course, we're going to nod like you're nodding now, but you're nodding naturally. You're not doing it because you feel like you should do it, or you're not sitting in a certain way. I think it's leaning into just literally listening and trying to feel and understand another person's experience. It's curiosity. Not, and again, it's nuanced, because you could get to the point where you seem really nosy and like overstepping boundaries if you're too curious. But you can try to ask more questions than you do talk, which is what you're doing, for example, on this podcast. It's really wanting to know, genuinely wanting to know this other person's experience, because whatever you're talking about, it tends to be about someone's experience. Even if you're talking about data, you're saying, what's your interpretation of this data? What are you trying to say with this data? And so it's that piece of, well, one thing I say, I used to say this to the leaders I work with, and now I've sort of said it more broadly, is it's kind of like, imagine you're a detective. And it makes it fun. And it's like, if you're a detective, if you think about your favorite detective, so Poirot is one of my favorite detectives. Now, Poirot isn't going to run in right at the beginning and go, I know who the murderer is. I know. Poirot is going to piece together bits of evidence, and he's going to listen, and he's going to talk to different people. And he's not going to be might be a bit intrusive at times, but not too intrusive. He's just wandering around. Columbo's another example. I love Columbo. But then the core thing is, you're being curious, you're being open-minded, and you're not jumping to conclusions. That, I think, is critical, because as soon as you jump to a conclusion about what the other person is feeling, thinking, experiencing, you've closed down that connection in some way. So it's trying to remain as open as possible.
As open as possible, applying radical listening, and being indifferent and kind of easygoing. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, you can try too hard. And I think it's not about trying too hard. We've all got the stuff we need. We're all humans. We know. I mean, we can all think of a time. This is another way of thinking about it. We should all be able to hopefully think of a time where we feel really seen and heard. And that's what we're trying to give to the other person that we're connecting with.
That's a cool energy feeling that comes on when you try to remember a time when you've been really seen and heard. It's like a very transparent glass, very just open-hearted type of feeling. And you're proposing it's like, how do you make somebody feel that? Well, you really try to see the world through their eyes. And as you meet people, as you go through the world, is that the mental state that you have? Or like, where does your consciousness, where does your sense of self sit or ride when you're going about through your activities, or when you meet somebody new? How does that feel to you?
And I think that's a really, really important point, because our self, or our view of ourself, will get in the way. Because we then, if we're meeting someone new, it's like, do they like me? Oh God, why did I say that? Or do I like them? And we have all these things coming into our mind which are distracting us basically from listening. And when you look at the Life Connective framework, that's why connecting to self is so important, because we need to understand ourselves and our gremlins and the things that are going to get in the way, and they're going to derail us, and they're going to, our insecurities and our strengths and all these things. Having an awareness of those massively helps. So when we talk about coaching, for example, really, really good coaching is about first understanding ourselves, because we need to understand what baggage we have that's going to get in the way. But the irony with this is I was highly trained in this, and yet I wasn't properly connecting with my friends. So there's still a part of, we have to do something with this information. We have to understand it and then do something with it. I should have been one of the most self-aware people in the world, but clearly something was going wrong. And it was actually when I moved here, I have a friend in San Diego who I met snowboarding in New Zealand, but I've known her for 20 years. And she said to me, "Yeah, Fee, you're really private." I said, "Am I?" I thought I'm kind of really open about stuff. She said, "You are open, but you're really private." And I thought, And it's when you're in a position where I was, where things are changing, so I'm more listening to those things, which I should have been anyway. I thought about that and I thought, I'm not vulnerable enough. I don't let people in. I had my own attachment issues, which were getting in the way. And so it is really important to understand ourselves. And it doesn't mean that we kind of have to understand ourselves, tick, then we can get on with other people. It's something that we're working on through life at the same time. And if you're in a relationship, whether it's a friendship or romantic relationship, those things are evolving and changing all the time as well. And that can sound really burdensome because you're like, oh God, am I ever going to get there? But the other way of looking is it's actually really fun, because it's this exploration to understand, who am I and what does that mean and how do I show up and what's this relationship about and what are the ebbs and flows and what does that mean? And maybe that is a psychologist in me. I'm like, I love that stuff. But
Have you built a mind map or like a flow chart that includes like all of these different aspects, these attributes, the values, the sense of self, if you had to mind map it versus the sense of self that is the underlying moment sense of self, like the stillness, like the deep sense that you discover in meditation. But is there a practice of mind mapping who we are and getting it on paper?
a great question. And what's coming to mind there is IFS, which is internal family systems. And this was developed by a guy called Richard Schwartz. He's a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and he's at Harvard. He saw patient after patient after patient and started realizing people would talk about almost like different versions of themselves. And then what you've described in meditation is the true self. So he calls it, I think, self with a capital S, or it's basically when we talk about ancient wisdoms or we talk about meditation, it's what's there all the time. And these other things come up. But in IFS, what he said is these other parts come up to at some point in life protect us from something. And unfortunately, they get stuck in time at that point in life. And IFS is something I would encourage anyone and everyone to read about and to explore, because it's so helpful, it's so powerful, and it fits in with other ways of looking at the world. It's not in antagonism with them. His first book's called No Bad Parts. So basically we're saying there's no part of us that's bad. It's there for a reason, and we need to try and understand what that reason is. And part of his exercises are mapping those things out. And then actually befriending that part of ourselves, which can feel a bit weird because we kind of, again, society brings us up to think there's one part of us, it's just us. But he's saying, well, no, there are all these different parts. And then you can start going, oh, that doesn't fit with my understanding of self or the world. But if you can lean into it and understand it, some of it's being proven now through neuroscience as well. And actually looking at ancient wisdoms, they would say a lot of the time very similar things. And it's like, how do I work with that? How do I make sense of that? And his second book is actually about working with that in relationships. It's more romantic relationships, but it still gives an idea, a sense of that.
What do you believe in terms of, do we have like one personality experience of ourselves, or do we have different shades or kind of different moments call for different aspects of who we are? Do we have a core self that's our personality, or do we have like a myriad of ways that we can express ourselves? In your experience, what have you found?
I think both. And I think within sport, for example, people will have a self that they put on when they go on to, say, they're playing tennis and they go onto the court. And that self is a way of seeing the world and responding to the world that protects other bits of them. With leaders, you can see a self that they put on when they are public speaking. And I do, however, believe, and I think a huge amount of research points towards the fact that we have a core self. And whether that has its own personality that you could describe in terms of personality testing is a whole other story, because there's different layers and levels to that. And I think we would have assumed, for example, 20, maybe 30, 40 years ago, we have a personality that is fixed when we hit 18. That's not true. We see now that we change and evolve through life, but there are stable aspects of it. But again, it doesn't mean it's going to be like that forever. If you have a major life event or something, that can change and shift. We become more introverted as we get older. Research has shown this over and over again. There are things that adapt, but I personally think we have our core self, and that's the self that we may come across in meditation, where the other things don't worry us. We're there. It's like a pure sense of who we are. And I think if we explore parts of ourselves, we can be in that space more often. And I think ideally for all of us, it's a far more fulfilling, enjoyable place to be. So it's something that, it's almost like stripping back all the other stuff to get to who we actually really are.
In your experiences, what have you discovered in meditation or in the like big epiphanies of Fiona's fully connected from one end of the universe to the other? How have you experienced it?
Yeah, obviously I'm a perfect being. Um, oh, I have. There's a lot of work still to do. I I personally, I'm actually potentially about to do ketamine therapy because I have traumas from childhood that are quite ingrained, which means that I have nightmares nearly every night or every night, and I have had since I was a teenager. And those are the sort of things that it's difficult to remove through meditation or therapy. So I'm hoping that this will help shift some brain patterns for me. And I know you then have to do work following that as well. Um, so I do meditate. Um, I've done self hypnosis as well, and I have got to that beautiful place. But it doesn't mean I think I'm any better than the next person that's sustaining it in day to day life. I do think personally, meditation makes it easier to give you those microseconds of where you step away from something and you reconsider how you're approaching it. And it's far easier to notice your thinking during the day, which is massively powerful because it gives you a huge element of control back. I think meditation's amazing.
What happens as you meditate? Like, what can you describe what you've learned and how, or your practice in getting to your center, into your stillness, into the deepest moments that you feel like more awake to who you are? How does that work? What happens?
For me personally, I don't think I've gone as far as I could or I should. I don't like the word should, but I think I listened to people like Dan Harris, who was the news reporter who had a breakdown on air and then sort of turned his life around quite dramatically, and spends a lot of time meditating and interviewing people on his podcast, 10% Happier, about their experience. And I think no one's really an expert in it, but you can become more experienced in it. I would love to do a retreat. I would love to spend more time disappearing into that amazing place. I do maximum of half an hour meditations, which I don't think are long enough to really, really experience it at a sustained level.
Yeah, I think meditation's interesting. It comes in ebbs and flows for me. I'm not sure if this resonates, but when I sit down and I try to meditate, it's a very calming kind of energy. And then there's the practice of different techniques. And then you realize, oh, wow, my mind is just trying to practice ongoing different techniques. And the best thing, I always kind of come back to Eckhart Tolle's feeling the entire inner body and not seeing any image or not trying to find any answer has been the best realization that I had to, if the timing, if the day is right. It's also one of these things where you can't ever force getting into becoming the holy lamp, where all of a sudden you kind of drop into there's a phase that I go through, and then it's like I just start becoming the universe, and then it becomes very, very deep, and there's like a never ending stillness to it, and it's just so it's like a new dimension that you get to experience, and then if you try to think about it, you start falling out of it, like you start coming back into the membrane of who we are, with being aware of not myself, or it's like I'm thinking about it, I'm overthinking it, and then I try to get back to it. So that's been my experience. I don't know, have you felt something similar, that like expansion feeling?
I have, and I've been thinking about it more recently because it was in self-hypnosis, and I would get this sensation where I am no longer in my body, and it was incredibly powerful, and something that you can't describe. And I think that's part of the point of it, isn't it? It's like, it's as soon as you try and understand it or describe it, then, like you say, it disappears. I had an
Yeah.
amazing hypnotist that I was working with in London, and he was just brilliant. But unfortunately, he then stopped working with people one-on-one and started teaching, which I think was better for the world in many ways, but then not for the people that were working with him one-on-one. But I haven't had that experience so much through meditation. The meditations I'm enjoying at the moment, I fluctuate between I do one that's more almost training. So it's like returning to the breath, noting, returning to the breath. And then I do another one, which is self-compassion, and that's far more guided, and it does involve imagery, but it's a very nice place to be because you're thinking about other people as well. You're thinking about people who care about you, those moments when someone sees you, like we were talking about earlier, and that puts you into a state of mind that you're not otherwise going to be in, because we generally walk around either thinking about something or worrying about something, or attacking ourselves verbally in our head.
Yeah, and then there's many times where you're not practicing that compassion. I don't do that more. I don't do that enough. I should be doing that more. Taking the time to like send compassion to people, and new people, or strangers in the entire world. There's many different levels to it. I end up getting caught up in the no thought space. Unfortunately, too much. But speaking of intentions, I want to ask you about beliefs, or how do you reprogram your values if you don't find that who you are is at the level that you imagine your potential to be? How do you then like slowly inject new software code to rise and to evolve in who you are, to step into the potential
I
of who you're
think
trying to become?
it's a really interesting question. And it's one that I've struggled with personally, is self-belief. So on the one hand, people think often outwardly I'm very confident and I've achieved things and I've gone after things and done things that other people go, oh, I'd never do that. But then I have huge levels of self-doubt. And actually my mentor got a little bit angry with me at Christmas when I saw him back in the UK, in a good way. But he's basically like, Fiona, unless you understand your worth, you're always pulling against two things in different directions, because you can continue to do well, but you're not doing as well as you could. And you're not doing it in a way that is fulfilling, basically. And I thought, people say to people, just believe in yourself. And I think, well, how? How do you believe in yourself? It's not easy. And I actually might write a book about that. But I think there's a woman called Kristen Neff who was a professor at Austin, Texas, University of Austin, Texas. She's done a lot of work on self-compassion, and I wrote about some of her work in my first book, but I thought it's not for me, self-compassion, whatever. And actually, it's the people that think that, I think, who need it more than anything. I think the language is difficult because it sounds a bit soft and a bit like, oh. But what it actually does is probably one of the most powerful things in helping people to get to a place where they can actually move forward and realize their potential. And in her book, I can't remember the name of the first one, but she's got a lot of tools and approaches. And I would say to people, you need to adapt them into a way that makes sense to you, and be sort of curious about the language and not get hung up on the language, because it might be that some of it you think, that's how I felt. But there are loads of different exercises that you can try, and some of them you'll try and you'll be like, no, that's not me. And some of them you'll try and you'll be like, And the one that I find the most helpful, and I'm not disciplined enough in doing it, she looked at people writing a letter to themselves every day for 7 days, as if they were a friend. And it might be that you're looking at a particular problem or something that you're struggling with, but you write that letter as you would speak to a friend, but you're actually writing it to yourself. And they showed that after 3 months, the people that had done that for 7 days had reduced levels of depression and anxiety. And I
Wow.
think it is incredible. And I think you think about it, it's something that we don't ever really deliberately stop and do. We don't think, hang on, how can I just slow down, talk to myself and encourage myself in a way that's really constructive, that's helpful, that's in my language? How can I do that? And even if we did it in our thoughts, it wouldn't be very deliberate. It would be a bit like, If you sit down and do it for 10, 15 minutes, it's deliberate, it's intentional, you're very focused on what you're looking at. And you're actually using different parts of your brain because you're slowing things down, you're writing, you're processing things, which I would assume, from my understanding, is what makes it so powerful.
Writing anything down. I've noticed in my own journey, the more that I spend time writing, I don't always do it as great as I wish I should be doing, writing every single morning. Now it's almost once a week or twice a week. When you go back and you review the notes and you review the stacks of journals that you've written, and you've tried to record some of your hardships, your low moments, your high moments, things you're passionate about, things you dream of that you want to do, it is peculiar to then kind of go back and see the outcomes, or the connecting some dots in a way.
Absolutely.
I think writing is so profound to be able to connect dots. And so I wonder if, with the intention of having a communicating channel to yourself, and you're writing this activity, you're helping kind of connect dots neurologically, so that these new impressions, this compassion model, or hey, you are good enough, or hey, you are strong enough, or hey, you can step into being that higher level person at your job, or you can start that company. You can step out of your comfort zone and say hello to that girl, or evolve and join a new club or a new group of people. Right? There's all these like different steps that we in our human lives are trying to take. Right? Over the years, we're all trying to expand our sense of self and our accomplishments and our worth, our self-worth, as well as just as important as your self love, your self-compassion.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And being able to see the patterns as well, being able to make sense. Basically, we're sense-making machines. We want to make sense of the world and ourselves. And to be able to see those patterns helps us to make sense of our own narrative and what that means in our journey. I think we can get stuck in a narrative. Well, I know we can get stuck in a narrative where we keep repeating the same story to ourselves. And again, writing is a very helpful way of reframing those things. It's very deliberate. It slows us down. It makes us think about it. It's incredibly powerful. And it's been shown to have a hugely positive impact. It's been done a lot with nurses on reducing levels of burnout. And in a way, you could say that writing in and of itself is an act of self-compassion. It's an act of saying, I'm giving myself the attention I deserve, but in a very constructive way, as opposed to,
I think it's an interesting journal prompt. As I've written a lot, over the years, I can't say that I have really wrote to a younger version of myself or wrote to myself from like a third person. Maybe I have in some like happenstance, but I never have tried that style. And I think if anyone's listening, seems like there might be something there to maybe write from a friend's perspective to yourself and to give that a go.
Definitely. I think it's really, really powerful.
Let's go back to that self-belief, the book that you were about to write. We can start unpacking some of that right now. How do you balance then that self-belief and that confidence in conversation? So when you meet people or when you're having conversation, is the key to always kind of see from their perspective? So you're out of your head, you're not thinking about yourself, you're not worried about yourself. You're more prioritizing them and what's going on in their world. And then how do you balance that with that self-confidence, that self-belief? How does that feel like if you had to describe the sensation or like the mental state, or how you magically correspond those two external and internal focus? How does that work?
Well, firstly, I think that what you suggested there of listening to the other person is a great way of getting out of your own head. And a bit like meditation, you do have to keep reminding yourself, because we've seen that mind wandering happens up to 40 to 50% of the time. So even when we're talking to someone, our mind will go off, and that might go off and start thinking about ourselves, or it might be what we're having for dinner, but it's to keep reminding ourselves to come back. But it's an amazing way of getting out of our own way. When I work with leaders, there's the type of leaders I've been lucky enough to work with. I've seen a lot of leaders, I mean thousands, because I've profiled thousands of leaders. But the ones that I end up working with ongoing, there's a bit of choice. So I choose leaders who are nice people. There's a worry that will I come across as arrogant, or am I too demonstrative, or am I dominating the conversation too much? And in that sense, I try and encourage them to think of themselves as someone who is calmly confident. And it's useful there to think of a role model and someone that you really respect. So for me, it's Maya Angelou. She's no longer alive, but she's one of the people I would bring to mind. And I think, well, how would she be? And she would have a sense of presence, bit of a humbleness to it, bit of confidence at the same time. And I think there's a way of holding those things, and you can look at these certain iconic figures and look at how did they do it, and then you can try and feel it yourself. And the best thing to do is to practice feeling that on your own, because then your brain will get more comfortable with it and more used to it. If you try and practice it for the first time when you're with someone you don't know, your brain's like off doing 1,000 other different things. But it's almost like, well, actually, it's very similar to visualization in sport. It's saying, I'm going to practice it, I'm going to embody it, I'm going to train my brain in how to do that, how to feel that. And then you might expect it beforehand. You might think, I'm going into this conversation, this is how I'm going to behave and feel. And then it might not work straight away, but it's far more likely to work if you do it that way.
And so that's this granular step of changing ourselves. Because if you already have an anxiety, nervousness, anxious kind of edge to you by just being at home alone or in social situations, then by impressing upon your experience, your inner body, the totality of what it means to be you, with the slight nudge of being more calm and having presence by role modeling someone that seems to have already figured out how to express that's one of the definitions of like changing yourself, and that there's like this stream of potential versions of us. Or is that just an emotion that we're feeling? Is it not really a different self? We're not expressing a new whole value system or a completely new history and biology background. We're not like changing our ancestry in our mind. What we're doing is we're trying to take on a completely new emotion and be able to neurologically activate just the best parts of our personality, be able to connect with somebody, to have a sense of freedom within ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think it comes back down to we're actually getting more to the core of ourselves. So it's not that we're changing, it's we're evolving into ourselves. So within the internal family systems, it's calming down those other parts and saying, it's okay, you'll have your time. You'll have your time to speak up, or, I value you. You've been there for me. You've protected me, but I don't need you right now. Right now, I'm coming from this part of me. But we do have to rehearse and practice that. Sometimes the other thing I will say to, or I will explore with a leader is, when have you been like this before? Because the chances are there's been a situation that we maybe haven't even thought of, that we've been like that before. And then I call it borrowing from ourselves. So we're saying, yeah, I remember in that situation, I was actually like that. And then the practice of visualization is then actually remembering how we felt when we were like that before. But it's being intentional about practicing it.
So that we can cement and anchor these prior rich experiences when we did shine, when we did express ourselves in a way that we want to fully integrate into our default mode of being.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there any other research or things that you've come across of how to change our beliefs or to help consciously program ourselves?
When it comes to self-belief, it's immensely helpful to find someone who believes in you. And I know that might sound easier said than done, but we sometimes have to be proactive and explore. And a lot of people say, well, I'd love a mentor, but I mean, how do I get a mentor? What does that look like? Where do I go? I'll just give a personal example. So I had a woman who was a beautiful soul, who was my mentor, who sadly passed away from cancer. But she was just a fantastic human, and just someone that was a joy to be around, and she incredibly accomplished as well. But when she died, I was 6-7 months after, and I thought, I really need a new mentor. I mean, I talk about mentoring. It's hypocritical if I don't have one. And slightly serendipitous the way it happened. A friend of mine who I was at university with a long time ago, I hadn't seen him for 10 years or something. And we met up, and he's a chief financial officer at this company now. And he was like, Fee, there's someone that you need to meet. I don't know why, but I just have a feeling it's really important that you meet him. And now my friend isn't that type of person. He's in finance. But he said he had this feeling. So I meet this guy who's called Manj, and I sit there and he watches me for a little bit. He talks and he listens, and then he produces this incredible insight about who I am. And I'm just like, wow. And he said, do you mind if I say something beforehand? He asked me. And I went away and I thought, I'm going to ask him to be my mentor. He might say no. I might feel really silly, but I'm going to ask him. And I'm very lucky that he said yes. So that was slightly serendipitous the way it happened. But my point is, you kind of have to be a bit brave, and you have to think, is this, and doing it for the right reasons. It's not choosing someone for status. It's choosing someone who you feel sees you, because that person is likely to then believe in you. And when someone else believes in us, it makes it far easier to believe in ourselves. And one of the things that enables us to do is to start proving to ourselves that we can do things, because we've got someone there giving us a little nudge or encouraging us or supporting us. And then we're like, oh, yeah, I didn't think I could do that. The other thing I will say is there's something known as the comfort zone model, which I have in my first book, actually, and I didn't design it. And a lot of people will have heard of it. But if you think about 3 circles, so you have the inner circle, the next circle, and the next circle. The inner circle is our comfort zone. The next circle, if we think about it in terms of sport to start with, is our stretch zone. And then the final circle is our injury zone. If you want to get better at a sport, if you sit in your comfort zone, you're not going to get better. You might be fine, and that might not matter. But if you want to get better, you need to go into your stretch zone. The thing is, sometimes you get tired in your stretch zone and you need to return to your comfort zone, but you can take little steps out into that stretch zone. If you push yourself too far, you go into your injury zone. Now, in sport, we know you push your body too far, you train too hard, you don't listen to what your body's telling you. You do something silly like I did when I was writing my first book, and you snap a ligament because you don't listen and you keep running on something. But anyway, another example of how I'm trying to learn. And so it's the same with actions that we take. So we might think, it feels comfy here, I don't want to go into my stretch zone. But if we take little steps into our stretch zone, and then you can return to your comfort zone. It's like saying, I haven't been out of the house for a while, and actually it makes me feel a bit weird and a bit scared, like after COVID or something. Go out your front door, come back and sit on your sofa. Then the next day, take another step, go to the end of your path, then go to the end of your road. But it's the same with behavior. It's saying you don't have to jump all in and do something. Take little steps into your stretch zone. Don't push yourself into your injury zone. Take little steps. And then gradually your comfort zone actually changes, and what you're capable of doing changes. But you also prove to yourself, I can do it. And when we do that, that helps to build the belief we have in ourselves.
Little by little expanding your zone of comfort. You don't want to go too far because then you might extend into the injury zone, like you said. I've got a question around the mirroring aspect, the book that you wrote. And I'd like to relate this to the universe or God or the kind of absolute energy. So if our role model, if we went to the absolute heights, is the universal force that sustains everything. If we were to place that as an intention, how does mirroring with that work? Or how does feeling and experiencing this higher quality of existence in our imagination and using our will, our desire, what can we do? And how does it work to connect with something like that in terms of mirroring?
I'm glad you put imagination in there because I would have been lost without that. Because it's difficult, because when we're talking about things like mirroring and the mirror neurons in the brain, it's very a physical thing. And so to then talk about something so metaphysical is like, I don't know, I've no idea. But when it comes to imagination, and it comes back to that piece of thinking about how we feel. So when you're describing that experience you've had, by re-rehearsing that in your brain, which isn't always possible when it's such an amazing experience that you were describing, where you really sort of felt like those boundaries of self were disappearing. But if you can recreate that to any extent, you're mirroring, that's using the mirror neurons as well. And the imagination is using mirror neurons. So you're recreating it in your brain. And so, to an extent, you're role modeling an experience you've already had. It's a bit like borrowing from yourself piece. We can't, in many ways, you could say you can't role model something metaphysical because you can't see it, but you can feel it. And feeling is part of it. But to do that, it's drawing it up into your imagination. It's not something you can look out and see and observe.
So mirroring in terms of that is if you've had the experience of, being up at the top of the mountain, ready to go down with your skis or snowboard, you can try to reimagine that feeling that you had. And you can activate some of the adrenaline or like the excitement, and that might be an interesting experience. Or you could pre-imagine the feeling of being in front of a large crowd and giving a speech and receiving the awards for all of the hard work in your business or in your career, in your art. And so then there's that aspect of like future dreaming where it's like you're trying to build up the experience via feeling. And so when it comes to meditation, or when it comes to what people say, like, hey, like, what's your connection with God or the universe, or the fabric that connects everything, like what's within the powering, the energy powering every atom in the entire universe, whatever that is, that substrate, that energy. How does that feel? And if you've got the experience of it, then are you just recreating it in your mind because your mirror neurons are firing, or are you actually experiencing it again firsthand?
Answer, I don't know. When you go on, I love your questions. I absolutely love the curiosity you have about everything. When you were starting that one, I thought we might get to a point where I can answer this, but unfortunately, no, I don't know the answer to that one.
What about the future experiences? Is there science or research in how that's impacted people? And I think we've all heard, or I've definitely I've come across, like, people in sports are visualizing the outcome. How much does that in sport activities or in social situations? What about imagining you're going to have a great business call, or imagining you're going to have a great podcast interview, or meeting somebody new? How much does that imagination and mirroring impact the experience?
Hugely impacts it. So obviously there are some things that are outside of our control. So, for example, if you were entering a surf competition, you don't know what the surf is going to be like. But if we're saying you're going to run a race, you know, apart from some weather conditions, you know the conditions, you know your own body. You're very much within control of that. If you're going to give a talk, you tend to be the one in control. Someone might throw a question at you that you're not expecting or something like that. But when you take things as far as you can control your own experience, you will enhance it through positive visualization. So there's research that shows that when athletes are injured, if they continue to visualize their sport, they can improve their capability. It also, if you use visualization on in a very concentrated way, you can improve the rate at which you recover from injury. There's loads of science behind all of this. There's loads of research. When it comes to visualization of a future state, I mean, I get leaders to do it often when they're thinking about where they're going to be giving a talk. If possible, go to the venue, see what it looks like, stand on the stage. So you've got more accurate visualization. The more detail you can put into it, the better. And the more sensory information you can put in it, the better. So what can you see? What can you smell? What can you taste? Have you just had a sip of water with lemon in? If you have, do that on the day. What can you hear? What can you feel? What sort of temperature is it? And then work through how you want to come across in that situation. Again, if it's a conversation or something, you don't know how the other person's going to respond, but you know that you're coming at it from the most positive point of yourself that you can, because you've rehearsed it. And when you rehearse it, your brain does not know the difference between reality and the mental rehearsal. And so you're actually training your brain to live in a certain way.
So when you're meeting someone, let's say for like a sales meeting, or you're doing a cold call, calling a prospect, to what extent are you trying to have their perspective in mind, where you're not in your head? I'm not trying to think about, I'm not putting pressure back on myself. I'm just trying to almost sync within your mind. And then you're also at the same time just seeing them respond well, and just like having a great connection there with like you're anticipating positive results and interpreting and trying to listen and see the world through their eyes.
Yeah, I think the visualization is that. It's the piece on how you're going to feel, how you're going to respond, but also having that sense of I am going to have a connection. It might not turn out like that, because there are elements that are outside of your control. But as much as those things are within your control, you're setting yourself up for success from a far greater sort of percentage outcome that it's going to be positive.
Is it better than to, in the moment, to give up the control, or trying to hold an intention of where your mindset or where your attention should be, because you've already done that pre-visualization prep work?
Well, I mean, there are bits of your brain that will interfere with you in the present. We all know we get a gremlin, you might say, that comes up and starts. You're going, why do I feel like this? Or why am I responding like that? But you've created it's a bit like, imagine you're growing some plants or growing some vines, maybe wine. I like that idea. So you're growing some vines and you're choosing exactly the right slope for those vines, and you're choosing the right soil for those vines, and you're giving them the ideal conditions to create the grapes that you want to make the best wine. So you're laying that down. It might be that there's, I say LA, so wildfire, flooding. There might be things that are outside of your control. But as far as possible, you're giving yourself the opportunity to create the best wine that you can.
And so is that like this nurture energy of open heart, kind of just giving yourself the freedom and the pre-visualization and in the moment to be able to perform at your best? You're just coming from a good energy of intention. Like you've got the soil, like you try to place yourself in like the best state, and you're supporting yourself so that you can trust yourself to be able to perform.
Yeah, you're training yourself, you're training your brain, and when that gremlin comes up, your brain's already rehearsed how to be 10, 15 times. The gremlin's still going to come up probably, but you're far more likely to be able to say to it, just go and sit down over there for now, because we're having a conversation. And so it just gives you more strength. It basically gives your neuronal pathways a built up. And so your brain, it's more habitual, it's more just what you'll do. So think of it like learning to drive a car. When we're first learning to drive a car, we're concentrating really hard and we're thinking, where do I go? What do I look at? When we've driven a car for, I don't know, a few years, and if we're taking the same route, our brain might be off doing something completely different than daydreaming, but we're still going to get from A to B because we know how to drive that car. So it's training your brain to be in the state of having driven the car for several years.
And does that feel, when you take that stance, like, hey, I've done this so many times, energetically, like how does that feel like when you're standing in that being? Is it your shoulders are kind of relaxed, like you have this kind of like entirely relaxed demeanor, you're confident, it's almost like an autopilot? Like how do you, it's as if like you're just assuming I got this.
Yeah, it's much more, you trust yourself, you're less anxious. I mean, if you're an anxious person, yeah, you're likely to be anxious, but you're less anxious, you're less on edge. If you've visualized yourself with your shoulders down, being for me, Maya Angelou, calm, considered, articulate, then you're again positioning yourself in that way that you're more likely to turn up like that.
Yeah. And then people and the energy that you bring into the conversation, you'll have that just as a presence, right? Like that'll be kind of your energy signature. And then you spend more time thinking about the other person, and feeling like there's a mutual syncing of connection that's happening as you're meeting somebody. There's a really great book, trying to remember. It talked about Maui. It was a guy that I can't remember the name right now, but it was essentially me plus we equals Maui. So it's almost like,
is it Daniel Siegel?
Daniel Siegel. Yes, that's him. That book was transformational when I read. I'm trying to remember.
I can't remember the name of the book, but he's brilliant. But sorry, I've interrupted.
He was after. No worries. But that's this, that there's kind of like a part of us that we can tap into when we get out of just our own head and we kind of create this new communication state. And I think that's what I'm trying to almost pull out for anyone that's listening, that's like wondered, like, how do you know what to say? Or if you've ever doubted yourself in a conversation or felt not confident, or needed to get an answer, like, where should I place my attention? My attention in meditation can be on my inside. I can be very relaxed in myself, but then maybe when I'm out in social settings, I'm not as outgoing, or I'm not as engaging with someone. I'm too in my own head. And I don't know, these are actually things that I've personally have had to kind of work through as I've discovered more about like how to connect with people and what processes are going on inside my own head and in my body, and how to best represent who I want to be in the world, and to trust myself in a very deep way that I can, and I know how to.
I think it's fascinating what you're saying, and it reminds me of the improv course I've just done. And you can get very in your own head because you think, what am I going to say next? And one of the things that we were trained to do is not to prepare what you're about to say, because someone might say something completely tangential and you have to respond really quickly. And so it's trusting that you are going to have something to say and not trying to prepare what you're going to say next, because you need to respond to what the other person has said, rather than for it to make sense to the audience, rather than to then come up what you're thinking and where you want to take something. And there's a lot around the improv style, which is fascinating, because it's try not to prepare, try not to think, be spontaneous. Trust, like you said, trust yourself that you will have something to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more you trust yourself and you can kind of release the tension that comes in thoughts, the tension that comes in your body, the tension that can be in your face, you can get into an integrated sense of self. And that's where the book, I looked it up, it's Mindsight.
Yes.
This book, Mindsight, that I read it twice. And he's got many profound concepts like the hand-brain model. That's where I learned about the prefrontal cortex, your limbic region, and your brain stem. And this kind of experience of being in the middle, where you're not bumping against the sides of the riverbanks. You're like kind of going in a very calibrated flow. You're flexible, you're adaptive, you're coherent, you're energized, and your faces. I can't remember what the S was, but it talks about how to be yourself. And I love the kind of the conversation we're having and all these things that we've talked about on this call, living this like life, this connected framework, valuing the connections and the people that we meet, how to communicate to engage people from like the best version of ourselves, or like the full potential version of ourselves. And how do we collect? How do we enhance? How do we draw into our identity, our subtle gradient slider of when we're at our real optimal, open to connect, not fully self-pressured on what I'm thinking or feeling defensive. Instead, we're meeting people kind of like in the middle, or trying to feel into their world to take it further, right? You could just be in the middle space, just like, hey, we're creating an experience together, or I can try to really see and get to know you. And then there's that level of sincerity that you've talked about, where it helps you forge and blossom into amazing friendships. And I think it just also is the genuine like human touch that you can like breathe and notice somebody and appreciate this moment that is fleeting and impermanent, and really value it in a way. Like you almost bring a light into the world in that moment when you take a breath and you share like a little loaf of peace with someone to share in that moment together.
I think that's beautifully put. I couldn't have said it like that myself, but really beautifully put. And it boomerangs back to us as well. And the science tells us that, but I think we can just sort of go on experience. How does it feel? And giving to someone in a way where they feel seen and heard and believed in, if possible, is absolutely magical.
Yeah. That's the magic of life. Fiona Murden, this has been an exciting conversation. I've really loved getting deep and just like collecting the little wisdom jewels that you've shared, and helped me remember some aspects myself.
I've really enjoyed speaking to you. I think this is a great podcast. I think you're very good at asking questions and listening and exploring and coming up with very big questions as well.
Sometimes maybe too big that don't have any answer at all possible. I heard this from somebody who really, I think, left a mark on me. He was like, you've got really great questions, Alexander. But I think this makes me think of stop asking why and start saying, wow.
I like that. I'm
And I was like,
all,
you know what? It's like, you might be onto something there. I might need to stop trying to get the answers to the impossible questions.
well, I think curiosity is imperative for life. So I would say don't stop, because it's, well, it'll feed your soul and it feeds other people's soul as well. I've really enjoyed speaking to you.
Outstanding. Awesome, Fiona. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.